So welcome back, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us through the day. So the man next to me doesn't really need an introduction, and as Joseph Wilder pointed out at the beginning of the day, the bios are in the program and online. But I should say, just a reminder of where John has come from and where he's been. Started out in Brooklyn, became a professor of religion, chair of a religion department, then went back to being a law student, then a law professor, dean, president of the university, and now I'm pleased to say he's my colleague again on the faculty here at the law school. And I think John would say that, maybe even insist, that he left legal practice and scholarship behind some time ago, but he took on a new vocation, really, which is he became a leading practitioner and I would say scholar of higher education, and legal education in particular. And so I can't think of anyone better to talk to us today about the idea of a global law school, sort of what it meant at the beginning, and then where we are today. I'm very curious what you think of what's become of this, and then really the future of this concept. So let me just start off really with that question about the past. You were here at the founding, and really, what were you thinking? What was the what was the idea? Because you think of law as being the most parochial of disciplines, and so the concept of a global law school is, in a sense, almost an oxymoron. So I'm very curious what the idea was in its original conception, at least.
Well, first of all, it's very, very generous for Kevin and the folks who organized today to put aside any time for you to listen to an 83-year-old person do some reminiscing. And maybe importantly, and earlier we talked in the panels about how much faith, I'll use the word faith as a theologian, how much faith we should put in the rule of law. Is it hypocrisy? Is it reality? Where is it along the spectrum of those things? And I, as a person who comes with my first doctorate in religion, think about communities like our community here, which we assemble today, as unified by, in the best sense, the Greek sense of the word, mythos, a story. And a story can be something that moves beyond the mind to touch the felt experienced. And it actually can be a deeper truth. And some of the deepest things we know, like love in an I-thou relationship, are known at the level of mythos and liturgy, not doctrine and concept. I say that because it's tied up very much in my experience of this day. I've been here all day long, and it's been quite a wonderful thing for me to see what this has been made to be. It would be wonderful to be able to claim some notion 30 years ago or 35 years ago when it was hard to explain to folks what it meant. When you said a global law school program, I'd love to be able to claim that there was some glimpse of something like today, but there was more a direction and a sense, I think an overwhelming sense, Kevin, as you put it, that law was a very narrow discipline. I remember as I went out to try to proselytize for this notion of law. And let me give you some of the backstory here. I don't want this to make you cynical. But if you're in a law school inside a university that deals, even to this day, and we're much better off today than we were, in a paucity of financial resources, and you want that law school to make a unique contribution, what is it that unites us as stewards of thought here in this room, as part of thinking society? What causes someone like a Kevin to forego the great income, probably 10, 20 times what he's able to make because he's embraced the vocation of teaching? What makes a person do that? What calls that calling? Well, it's got to be that you're doing something that's useful, that you're moving the pebble of justice a little bit farther down the road. And if you want to create an institution that can put a claim on people's talent and attract some of the best people in the world, when you don't have the financial resources to do it, and you're not, and we weren't at the time, we were a very good law school. I mean, I chose to come here in 1981, and it was an odd choice to come here in 1981, partly because I was coming to NYU Law School. Most of all, I should add, for those of you that are too young to know this, because no one wanted to be in New York. You couldn't give away apartments on the west side of Washington Square Park. Those university buildings with faculty housing were empty. Right? NYU was, when I came here, 5 years. It was 1981. NYU was 5 years past selling 1/5 Avenue, the building to the right as you look through the arch, for less than the cost of a 2-bedroom apartment in that building today. The whole building was sold for $2.5 million. Nobody went to be in New York. There were 32 Supreme Court clerks my year. I was the only one to come to New York. For any reason, the top 10 law firms in the world were in New York. It was the murder capital of the world. You had to step over people to get into this building. Okay? It was a different time. But it was also eccentric when, you should have seen the shutters. I thought the Supreme Court was going to collapse, those pillars outside, when I decided to come to NYU instead of Columbia and turned down offers from Harvard and Yale. But there was something in this place, and there was a specialness to it. So we get to 1988 when, in a very unpopular move, and I'm not just saying that to be humble, there are statistics that could prove it. It was quite unpopular when I was chosen as dean. Not with the security guards or the cleaning people or the students, but there were 65 of us on the faculty, and I remember the president of the university, we weren't allowed to rank, but we could rate. And 5 was, it's a very good idea, and 1, it's a horrible idea. And 30 people of the 65, my friends, put down 1 horrible idea. And only 15 put down 5. But in any case, part of that was because we were saying there's a mission. We're going to call you back from the law firms and have you be embracing the vocation of teaching. And we were playing to something which wasn't monetizable. Okay, and this gets to your point about the strategic move that this involved. Wasn't monetizable. It didn't play to the financial capacities of NYU Law School, but it played to the locational endowment. We were in New York City, which in a way was a miniaturization of the world. This is the first city in the world that has a neighborhood for every country in the world, populated by people that were born in that country. So you could get on a bus and go hear any language and taste any food, and that was a locational endowment. And we were in the city in a different way, because at that time, more even than today, Columbia was a gated community separating itself from the city, but I used to say we have no grass on campus, but then I realized that was a double entendre. So I said, we have no blades of grass on campus. You can't be so near. You go out in the courtyard, you can smell the grass from the park. But we have no blades. So there was that locational endowment, which was a miniaturization of the world. And there was what I used to call the immigrant's attitude of New York. 40% of the citizens of New York were born in other countries today, and even then. And my wife once said NYU became the best law school and the best university in the world that would try something that could be a complete failure. We were willing to take risks because that's the immigrant attitude. The immigrants don't look back and say, oh, we have so many. Well, look, tell me about Dog Gold, and we've been around for so many. The immigrant's looking for a better tomorrow, right? So those two endowments, and then there was the conceptual endowment of embracing difference. That was one of the generative ideas. And I'll tell you a moment that happened. I have this checkered serpentine past, and I know a lot of really, really big shots who, when I knew them, they were in high school getting their brains beaten out by a group of Brooklyn young women with accents that make me sound like Sir Laurence Olivier. And it was a high school debating team. So Larry Summers, okay, I remember him when he was a high school debater at Lower Merion, and he still can't get over the fact that he lost 3 times to these young women from Brooklyn. He can still tell you why the judges were wrong. So the interesting thing that came from that was that a guy named Cass Sunstein, you may have heard of him, because somebody was referring to us as the regulatory, administrative law. Right? Cass has had a move or two in that direction. But I've known Cass since he debated against my girls. And he called me up, and he said, the Chicago 5 are in play. I said, who are the Chicago 5? And he says, it's the political science department of the University of Chicago. And he said, political science is connected to law. I said, oh, really? I've surrounded myself with people smarter than me for my whole life. So, I'd never noticed that, right? So he says, I think you can get them to come to NYU. And the NYU political science department was in receivership. It was like a B- political science department. But because of Cass, I started talking to people with names like Stephen Holmes. And Stephen, I had to fly to Paris to see those guys. I always believed in a dramatic move. My wife married me 2 months after we met, but I had many dramatic moves during that 2 months to convince her to, buy low. I'm going to become something. So I remember I flew over to meet the dramatic gesture. I didn't bring roses or anything like that, but I flew over, and Stephen wouldn't come here to the political science department. Stephen's first appointment was tenured here in the law school and tenured in the Princeton political science department. And then finally we got Russell to come, Russell Hardin and Adam Jaworski, but it was because of Cass Sunstein. And then I said to myself, no, wait a minute, I was on the plane coming back from recruiting those guys. And I said, why am I always recruiting Americans? It just hit me on the plane, you know. Because you got to remember, I came to studying law with a PhD in religion, and I got news for you. There are religions out there in the world, and some of them don't even descend from Abraham. I mean, it's a pretty remarkable thing, and some of them have been around, you know, like the Bhagavad Gita, you know, or this guy Buddha, or Confucius. You know, maybe there's a lot of wisdom out there in the world. You know, we're in this infant country that at the time was a little more than 200 years old, and I said, wow, I wonder, you know, and then because I'm a big baseball fan, I'm trying to give you a sense of how things that don't seem to be connected get connected. Okay? Now, I don't think there's and there's some people, Frank Upham's been in the Grand Canyon with me, river rafting twice for more than 9 days. Even he doesn't know where I'm going with this one. The Brooklyn Dodgers were the first team to scout players in the Caribbean. Nobody was scouting them. Do you know that today in Major League Baseball, 1 out of 10 Major League Baseball players is from the Dominican Republic? I mean, the Caribbean, they were playing baseball down there, and they know how to play baseball, and they were damn good, and the Dodgers were the only ones that were drafting. And I said, wait a minute, I'm just recruiting Americans. So I went to the faculty, the people that knew, and I said, let's make up a list of the 20 top thinkers about law outside the United States. And let's see if we can persuade a guy like Dieter Grimm or Giuliano Armati or Marty. These were among my first draft picks. But nobody else was drafting. You know, so I could go up to Hisashi Iwata at the UN. He was, not only was he Japan's ambassador to the UN, he was Japan's top legal figure, and he was the father of the crown princess. And I had a couple of meals with him, and before you know it, he was a global professor, and he would come down and teach a course, and all the good Japanese students stopped going to Harvard and started coming here because they weren't going to give offense to Hisashi Iwata, who later was on the World Court. So it was a very simple idea that grew out of the study of religion, frankly, and moving from a world in which in 1955 I thought only people who were of my faith, the Roman Catholic faith, could be saved. Thankfully, through the Vatican Council and ecumenism and so forth, theologically, to a notion of secular ecumenism. And once that clicked for me, then all these, so then, that was kind of the generative idea, but it was, I'm just going to close with this. I can see he's getting impatient with me. You know what? You can tell he's still a rookie. Who would ever say to me, I'm going to ask you a question and you just talk? I mean, think about that. Most people say, you understand, and they say it publicly, you're a windbag, keep it, you only got, you know. Anyway, just to finish, if you're going to create a place, and we were trying to create a place that had a specific view of what being a lawyer was, and it's really important for the students that are in the room or those that are teaching students today. I had so much fun teaching the students at the law school in my seminar this past year because the question, it was about the religion clauses of the First Amendment, but the question I put on the table was, are you here for a job or a vocation? Because in a society that has no binding mythos other than law, de Tocqueville said this about us, the lawyers are the civil priests. Right, so what we were trying to do very consciously, and when I say we, I mean the group of folks who ended up, because the two people we wanted who were outsiders withdrew from the meeting, saying to me, you go do it. Okay, and for me it was just a different teaching platform. You could act as a possibilitarian and say to a community, I can tell you a story, do you want to be it? And that what we wanted to be was lawyers who viewed the law as sacred, who saw being a law professor, a law teacher, a thinker about law, about what the should of law should be, not just the is of law, the ought. It was a vocation. So we wanted to create a community that was dedicated to that concept, where the faculty stayed around. It was essentially, I used to say in the early days, a Jesuit high school at the law school level, because it just started in the classroom and then spread out into conversations, and doors were open and faculty were around and so forth. And the instrument became, if you're going to become that, you want the best people to be part of it, or at least the best people that are attracted to that. The best people are attracted to that. So you want to do something, you have to change the norm of what a law school will be. And this is something Rita Hauser will never get complete credit for until today. Okay? She became my partner in this. And she saw it. And we had these early conversations about this. But Rita and Gus were married in the Harvard Chapel. They met at Harvard Law School. He was 2 years ahead of her. He got his JD from Harvard. Then he came to New York. She had only finished her first year. She did her last 2 years here. You get your degree from where you do 2 of the 3 years. So she was an NYU graduate, but she was head of the Harvard Alumni Association. She presented as Harvard at her law firm. I went down and confronted her with that. Okay, but Rita got immediately what we were trying to do as a concept, as a direction, and she and Gus endorsed it with their first gift to this. And from there came the talent, because we were the only people drafting people like Dita. And then came the students, and the wonderful students who came, first with the Hauser program, and then, because this became the place to go as we began to build on that. And the wonderful person, I haven't heard his name mentioned all day long, so give me one more minute. I sat down in the booth, my official booth when I was dean, in the diner on West 4th Street here. First booth inside the door to the right. No, this man, Norman Dawson, who I used to refer to during my 14 years as the Uber dean, because Norman really should have been a dean of this law school. He wanted to be, and he just played it wrong each time. And we became so close. I gave his wife's eulogy as well as his eulogy, and his daughters are like my sisters. And we sat down there, and I said, Norman, Rita Hauser and I have come up with this concept. I want you to lead it. Now, he was the head of the American Civil Liberties Union. He said, what do I know about international law? He said, I said, that's the fundamental flaw. That's the fundamental flaw. I'm going around the country talking to our alumni at law firms, and some leader of the environmental practice at Wilson Sonsini puts up his hand at the end of the table to me and says, what are you talking about the global law school? My field's environmental law. It's about local stuff. Climate change. You know, but people didn't see it at first. And Norman said, I can't do that. And I said, Norman, no man is an island. So, you know, you quote a little literature. You look smart, people follow, if you've got other good people to follow. That's basically it. I mean, it was just a thought, not a plan.
Or a direction. Okay. So, but it is an idea now. It's been realized, it's evolved.
Oh, does that make it better?
Well, that's actually going to be my question. Do you think it's a good idea? And what do you say to the critics? Because if you go out to some of those alumni, I think you'll find some who will say still, well, what do you need with this global stuff? environmental law, at least in the US, is not very concerned with climate change now. It's still a very local thing. So that'll be the sort of pragmatic side of it. And the more intellectual side, if I put it that way, is that, well, this global law school thing, it's just a reflection of a fundamentally flawed globalist ideology, and that we should really focus on understanding properly our intellectual tradition, the Western intellectual tradition, really delve into that, as opposed to looking overseas, engaging in some form of intellectual tourism without really being likely to reap any particular benefit. So you see where I'm going. That's a
Yeah,
direction
no,
that
I
thought,
can
but
not only see where you're going, but I think at least a half a dozen times as you spoke, and I pride myself in being a relatively serene person, but about half a dozen times my heartbeat really quickened with rage at the just, and I'm very hard, I generally don't judge, but the absurdity of some of the things that you uttered. I know you weren't uttering them as yourself, but they're so counter to what I said. Now, I have to report to you from my lunch with Harold Coe. Harold Coe was in the first law school class I taught. And I was in the unusual position of teaching Arthur Miller's civil procedure class, 6 classes over 2 weeks when I was a second-year student. And then I did it again when I was a third-year student. And Harold was in that first class, and we became friends, and he's like a son to me to this day. And he gave, if you heard, I don't know, he's a great wordsmith. I'm pretty good, but he does it with that nice giggle of his that I can't do. But he gave his 4 R's. So there's resist, and then there's resilience, resistance, resilience, reconstruction, and reform. And at lunch, all I had to do was show him the pad. I said, you know, that was good enough that I wrote it down, but you'll notice there are 5. So it's resist. This is now modified coming from both of us. I'm authorized. It's resist, it's resilience, it's reconstruction, it's reconciliation, and reform. And I think the techniques that we began with Alec Borain, who came as part of this program, in and around truth and reconciliation, are an important part of the answer. Now, what's notable about what I said by compared to what Kevin said, you see, from the beginning, the concept of what we were trying to do, the direction in which we were trying to go, was not global in the sense that George Soros had used the word globalization. And maybe it's fitting that we're antipodal, or I come right after the antitrust group, even as they said that they will become obsolete in 10 years, or at least 2 of them thought that. But the globalization, we thought, the synonym for it comes from theology, and it's ecumenical. Okay, I was taught by a man that his name, again, should be mentioned, the way Norman Dawson should be mentioned, but for very different reasons. His name was Daniel Berrigan. Daniel Berrigan was a Jesuit priest who was the Martin Luther King of the peace movement. And in 1955, in a classroom in Brooklyn, I was a 12-year-old in the 9th grade. And Danny Berrigan, this great man who 10 years later would lead the peace movement, wrote on the blackboard, "Extra ecclesia nulla salus." Outside the church, there's no salvation. And I went up to him after class and I said, "Father Berrigan, does that mean my best friend Jerry Epstein can't go to heaven?" And he said, "If you don't baptize him, John, he won't go to heaven." Now, I'll tell you something. My Lisa Goldberg, has a higher place in heaven than I'll ever hope to have, whatever heaven is. Now, what's the connection? The connection is this, okay? The people that don't see the dignity of every human being on earth. They don't see the moral imperative that the law creates. Call it human rights if you want. Call it USAID if you want. Whatever you want to name it. Okay? I'm not talking Soros and supply chain. That's part of it. Okay? And maybe if you're taking a utilitarian view of the law as a deal maker from Wilson Sonsini or one of the other big corporate law firms, you say, oh, wait a minute, this is getting complicated, and we have the vicissitudes of a clown president who's seeking only pleasuring himself by showing he can do whatever the hell he wants. And I should take this moment to say, and his son-in-law who graduated from this law school, who I have officially inducted into the NYU Hall of Shame, first member, to his face, because of the dismissing of the sacrality of what we taught, not because of policy differences, okay, but the dismissing of the sacrality of the law. So if you make it nothing but utilitarianism, then maybe there's an argument to be made that the global law school program, but if you reposition the global law school program as the embrace of the elevation and the dignity and the entitlement to voice of every human being on earth, and you begin to use your skepticism about the law, which we all should have. It's not given at Sinai, right? It's the best we can do at a given moment in a particular political arrangement, even if it means calling people 3/5 of a human being, or not having people vote if they don't own property, and all of that. But it's the best we do. We got to make it better. That's the job of those who are the stewards of the law, to make it better. If you don't see the importance of that, and the importance of seeing it for all people, and turn your skepticism to things like the notion of sovereignty and my land. I teach a lot in Abu Dhabi, right? For 20 years, I flew over there every 2 weeks to teach. And I would teach the NYU Abu Dhabi students, who are from all over the world, in the morning on the Sundays I was there. But in the afternoon, I would teach 20 Muslim Arab students who weren't NYU students. They were in their colleges. They would come for one course to get a taste. So I've always had an interest in those students who then subsequently have come here. And I remember having an encounter with a wonderful woman named Alia out in the courtyard, and she was covered, so I went up and I did my fist bump, because that allows the women that don't want to touch to stop before they touch. And I said, I don't know you, but I do know you didn't have the courage to take my course. And she said, who are you? And I said, well, I'm John. And so, and then she began to tell me she worked at the UN, and she was from Saudi Arabia. And I said, oh, I got a great idea. Lana Nusseibeh, the ambassador to the UN from Abu Dhabi, from the Emirates, is the head of the General Security Council right now. And she and my former NYU Law School student, Sarah Weiss, who's the legal counsel to the Israeli delegation, are doing a program on women at the UN. Why don't the two of us go to lunch with them? You're a woman at the UN. I would never go to lunch with an Israeli. I said, really? Why? They took my land. This is 6 years ago. I said, really? I said, listen, Alia, who owns New England? Where does the property chain begin? This is a construct, right? And we have to accept the fact that it's a construct. We have to be skeptical about it, maybe even a little hypocritical about it. But we have to make it the best it can be. And if you don't see that that involves every part of the watch of humanity, and our job is to make the elements work together. And that's what the Global Law School program essentially is at its essence. So do I think that's less important today? No. Now, as to the particulars of the program, hey, right? it was a great show called Hogan's Heroes, and there was this Sergeant Schultz, and he would say, I see nothing, I say nothing. That's me, okay? I was given my moment to shape the place. I'm glad that the trees that I planted in 1988 have now grown to the 3rd floor. But you know what? Somebody could have come in and taken all those trees out. You know, if that guy Revez didn't agree, and then that guy Morrison and that guy McKenzie, you put a possibility on the line, you give a story, people accept it. If it's worth something, it survives you. You have no rights of comment once you leave. So I'll go this far. Do I sit back there for this day and say, wow, they did a very good job of nurturing that seed. And it's something I couldn't have imagined. You know, whether it's 2.0 or 3.0 or 4.0. Wow. My one word would be wow. But beyond that, you know, could I have imagined this? No. Could I have hoped that it would be as important a source as it is? No. Is it organically connected? Yes. Does that please me? Yeah. And for that, I tip my hat to people like Norman Dawson and the others that came with their talent, because they were afraid if they left it to me, it would fail.
Well, first, thank you. I'm glad you're pleased with the legacy, and we're very grateful.
Listen, it doesn't make any difference if I'm pleased or not. So don't derive any joy from that. The question is it aligned with your Tao, not mine?
Okay. Thinking about the future, though, because you mentioned survival, what do you think are the prospects? Because the times are challenging.
Oh, yeah.
We're not so affected by the cuts to research funding and so forth, but we are, and so far we haven't been targeted in the way that some of our peer institutions have been in terms of, you know.
Maybe after what I said about Jared, we'll.
Perhaps. But we are still affected by things like the move towards deglobalization and the restrictions on immigration and student mobility, and you know, maybe even some of them that might be motivated by concerns about national security. And so I think there's a real threat, actually, to not only the idea of the global law school, but the practice of it. And I guess I'm just wondering what you think about that. Are you as optimistic as some of the panelists earlier today were, Sir Harold in particular? Or do you think we might have some, well, do you think this will survive, I guess, is the basic question.
So I'll try to be brief. We have no choice but to be optimistic. Okay, this is Pascal's wager in a different form. Okay, I have formed what I call the Sisyphus Society. The Sisyphus Society, and the way I calibrate it is Sisyphus is given the opportunity to roll a rock up the hill. And those of us that are trying to roll a rock up the hill, hard as it is, have to keep trying to roll the rock up the hill, because if we stop it, we'll never get to the top of the hill. And people forget that the famous Camus essay that starts, the only legitimate question is whether to commit suicide, ends with the sentence, "We must imagine Sisyphus happy." And that's what must keep us going. And I think that's what Harold was saying as well. And I believe that. Okay, so the one thing I know, this is the Pascal's wager part of it, is if we don't believe that and we stop, then there's going to be this constant kind of retrenchment into intellectual, legal, social, moral caves. And even the utilitarians will say that doesn't work in a division of labor way of doing things. There is a Pareto optimal, and there's a moral Pareto optimal. Now, you don't have to theologize it the way I do, and I want to emphasize I'm not talking theology here. I'm talking a secular version of Teilhard de Chardin, perhaps. Okay, that there is a point omega that we can see, and it is worth moving toward that point omega or that lodestar. And look, I think there's all kinds of evidence that we can raise. Steven Pinker does an analysis of how many people have been moved out of poverty and so forth, and that's kind of the danger of macro statistics. But the fact of the matter is that even if we have to do what Confucius urged us to do, which is to start with the center, the bullseye of the dartboard, and get ourselves straight, and then gradually move out as many concentric circles as you can in your influence. And law is the instrument to do that, I think, to get out into the wide circles. And if we can see it as that, and enough of us intentionally embrace that, no matter what field we go into, then I think there is a bright future ahead. I think it's inevitable. But you take the Supreme Court. Now, I gave the Supreme Court Historical Society lecture 7 years ago, so before Dobbs. And it's in the courtroom, and the justices are there. I had an audience of one, and it was my classmate and co-clerk, John Roberts. And I talked about the danger of the court losing its moral authority, quite directly, using the rhetorical device that I was talking about, Warren Burger's view of the court, because I clerked for Burger. I was saying essentially he viewed that moral authority sacredly. Now when I teach my classes, I have to say to the students, this court is not operating as the kind of court. Again, I'm not talking about specific decisions, but if you disregard precedent, as you do in Dobbs and West Virginia versus EPA, you're no longer channeled. But I can tell you of cases where votes changed on which I was a law clerk. So if it once was, it can be. And it's going to take a generation of people continually to try to roll the rock up the hill. So do I think the notion of a global law school as we envisioned it and as this program shows it is destined to failure? God forbid. God forbid. And I'm not going to make that prediction or wager, because I believe in the power of words. And I believe that if we stay at it, which is the purpose of a day like today, that there'll be little victories and we'll work our way out in that concentric circle. So I think it's more important today than it was 30 years ago.
Let me try a slightly different tack.
I'm sorry if I didn't answer your question.
No, that's fine, because
Being polite.
No,
See, you can't be.
I'm Canadian. It's
Yeah.
just impossible. But I do want to open the floor for questions. But just this image of concentric circles of influence. I'm wondering if the center of those circles necessarily has to be here in the United States, in New York, or if it seems more plausible than before that actually the center of the centers of influence might be somewhere else, right? I've been touring around. There are quite a few global law schools now. I just came back from one on the other side of the world in Singapore.
I thought you said it was failing.
Well, it might be. The question is it failing here?
No, but you see, that's the Teilhardian analogy to evolution, right? If you've not read Teilhard de Chardin, this is a philosophical, theological way, but he's making a Christian argument about the evolution of humankind, and he says emergence, divergence, convergence. But the emergence occurs in evolution, in biological evolution, with things popping up, failing, popping up, and then one takes, and then it diverges into the great diversity we see. And then there's a convergence on point omega, and you pass a critical threshold, and the whole process starts again, right? So you're saying fail, failure. I mean, I hope that NYU continues to be a vital participant, both individually and as a university. I mean, you talked, I have to say, my mind arced when you said, it's under attack. I created NYU Abu Dhabi with a team that included Linda Mills, so a tremendous president. And I teach over there. I'm part of that faculty. And we had 500 faculty families and 2,000 students. And the Emirates has taken more bombing than Israel. Okay? So I'm literally worried about that 20-acre campus. Okay? And you talk about being attacked. Okay? And that was a very controversial move because of Islamophobia and how could you do it? And, then when you got the 27th Rhodes Scholar, in the 10th graduating class, people say, oh, well, that was a pretty good academic move, and then the bombs start, right? So, but do you want to know something really interesting? Virtually no student, faculty, or staff people in that campus have accepted our invitation to fly them home. We're part of the mission. Okay, so it's what I'm trying to get at here. Go.
No, thanks. That was, yeah. Let's open the floor for questions. We've got mics in the back, and yeah. Frank, do you want to start?
I need to leave, but I would just want to.
I'm sorry you didn't walk out and protest. I was hoping I could get you angry.
I was going to just walk, not necessarily protest, just general reasons, but I didn't for the reason that I want to thank you. And I want to thank you for mentioning Norman Dorsey. Because especially in a group like this, it's been a long time. I used to say, like another leader of NYU Law School in the past, had never been on the mainland of North America. And I was wrong because I am too very parochial and didn't realize that Queens is on the mainland. But the combination of you and Norman transformed, I won't say global legal education, I'll say transformed legal education globally. And for that, I want everybody, I don't know, but obviously you deserve tremendous credit. So does Norman and the other people who were here in the 1980s. So thank you.
Well, and look, and the people who came took a chance on it. I remember when Dick Stewart came and Joseph Weiler. I mean, these were big moves for people to make. And a lot of people ratified this. And then Ricky came along and stayed with it, and Trevor stayed with it, and Troya stayed with it as the deans, but all the wonderful people like Kevin. So, but Norman Uber alles.
Rachel.
So I know we've tried to stay away from talking about AI in this conference, but I can't help.
What is AI?
It's going to change all education, and I wondered what your thoughts on how it's going to change global legal education.
So Kevin knows this because he's followed it closely. Since 2016, when I became President Emeritus, I've continued to teach a full schedule, but I've also been involved in a lot of work with refugees. I'm haunted by the fact that there are 40 million children in the world right now of school age that won't meet a teacher for one day in their entire lives. not one day. And there are 350 million other children that just can't, because of where they were born, get past the 4th grade. That's 400 million, some of whom are as smart as the smartest person in this room. So I'm kind of haunted by that. You'll see the relevance of this in a moment. And I've been an important part of creating 2 universities to try to address that. One is called, and I want you all to know about this and go out and tell taxi cab drivers about it and tell doormen about it, okay? One of them is called the University of the People. We have over 150,000 students now in 200 countries. It's tuition free. It's low tech. We're educating more refugees than the rest of American higher education combined. It's an American accredited degree, associate, bachelor's, and master's. The other one's called the Asian University for Women, which is residential, again, American accredited. It's in Chittagong, Bangladesh, and is educating the poor of that region. We've just got our 600th Afghani woman out of Afghanistan. We smuggle 20 a month out. We paid off the Taliban along a certain route. We have 60 Gazan women waiting to get on a plane. We've got their passports, we've got the plane, we've got everything else. But the Palestinian ambassador to Bangladesh is accusing me and the president of the university of being human traffickers. It's been a year. Now, why do I tell that, Nancy, to your question? My vision of higher education, you're not taking me to that level, right? Not just legal education, is that it's a symphony orchestra. And we've got to make sure, if we're going to care about the 8 billion people in the world, that every child who is born, with whatever capacities he or she is born, can do as much as he or she can dream of doing with what talent he or she has been given. And that means a lot, probably 4 or 5 times as many as are in universities today, should be in universities of one kind or another, whether it be community college to associate degree. I'm not saying everybody should be a professor, but the thing it means most is one size fits all doesn't work. And where AI, I don't know, maybe people have just forgotten this, but about 4 years ago, when AI was pretty primitive, Stanford University gives an award each year to the top teaching assistant. And a woman won that award going away, and it turned out it was artificial intelligence. And she was available all the time, and she never got tired and never sent a crossword and helped the students with their classes and so on. But I think the first thing I think of when I think of AI is some of the positive things it can do in terms of democratizing education, as long as we don't capture the poor in the University of the People. As long as people we got a student now getting her PhD at MIT who, as a homeless person in California, went to the University of People for 2 years, then transferred into Berkeley, then on down. You got to give ladders up of opportunity. But as long as you do that, I'll take whatever comes. Now, the theologian in me worries about all of the implications in and around AI and the potential dehumanization of people, and worse yet, and here I'll make a connection I think it'll be pretty obvious, but maybe not. Lisa always said, nobody gets your connections. So there is a very robust tutoring industry on the Isle of Manhattan that plays upon the neuroses of Manhattan parents who pay fortunes. You wouldn't believe how much. My son, the actor, is the top math tutor in the city, so I know how much his company charges the Goldman Sachs people that don't know what they're paying, but it's more than a Wall Street partner per hour, okay, for a math tutor and a big brother. And I know my son is tormented, even as he supports his family that way, and now, having gone to NYU at the age of 52 and graduated at 55, he's opened a storefront office to give free legal services in a kind of Robin Hood mentality. But that's a huge divide in society as we move with the importance of standardized tests and so forth to gain opportunity. And I think of AI having some of the same dangers because there'll be those that will know how to use AI not to do the work. The danger is there'll be a downward trend for people who use AI to do their thinking for them, and there'll be others who know how to use AI to elevate their thinking and ask it the right questions and then go beyond. And that's going to be another great divide in society that I think we're going to have to manage. And then there's the dehumanization and the kind of loss of soul and value that comes with it. So right now we're in a moment where we're 10% down a road. And the thing I'm focused on most is using those elements of AI that can be to help make education more pervasive beyond the University of the People, okay, because we're beginning to use it in the University of the People a lot. And on the other hand, I've just begun creating, we'll be announcing this probably in about 6 months, one of the elements on which I'm working is to create a kind of Institute of Advanced Studies around the issue of humanities and AI. And how, because the humanities, if you think about it, were the first disruptor. and we have to make sure that we continue to think about the role of humans, qua humans, in an evolving society. And we have to move a little bit, we have to not only think about Homo sapiens in this process, because I've talked all about education, because that was your question, but Homo ludens. Homo ludens preceded Homo sapiens. Okay, man the player. How are we going to use free time if we're able to liberate it broadly for society? You know, not just for the few of us that are in the privileged class. So there's a great dilemma coming up, but for me, it plays nicely into the symphony orchestra approach to higher education, and not everybody having to be the global network university or the top research university or whatever.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd love to stay to
No, you wouldn't.
listen. No, I would. I
mean,
honestly
the
would. because-
mendacity, brother, as Big Daddy said in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, the mendacity of the man.
No,
Thank you all for putting it up. It's amazing you stayed around, but I appreciate it very much. Let's just close. Okay, can I close with one story?
Not like the first one.
Not as long as the first one? Is that what you meant? Okay. Man, that gets a jab in. Was that below the belt? I think that was below the belt. You know, you are a nasty man. You come on with this Canadian aw shucks and not like the first one. Whew! Our anniversary was August 2nd. And we were out at Fire Island for it. And I had a breakfast with Rita Kauza, August 3rd, 1992. And she and I have been talking about her getting involved. And it was that morning that I asked her for a $5 million gift to start the Hauser program. And it had the Hauser faculty, Primitive 1.0, and the Hauser Scholars 1.0. And she said, I'll talk to Gus. I'll talk to Gus and we'll see. But I like the idea. I don't know if you noticed about Rita, but she was the back channel for the Oslo Accords. I mean, she was a player in international politics. So about 2 months later, she calls me up. My office and her office scheduled breakfast at the Regency Hotel. Now, the Regency Hotel was an NYU room. The power breakfast, they labeled it. And it was, maybe a room about this size, and maybe there were 20 tables, and it was like a show because everybody had his or her table, a power broker. I had my table. And you'd bring in the pigeon, and of course, the mayor would show up, and dignitaries would show up, and they'd go around and say hello to everybody at the tables, and the pigeon, oh man, I'm in the power room. But of course, Rita knew that. But she said, "Oh, let's have breakfast at the Regency." So we get to the Regency, and we're sitting at my table, and right over her shoulder was the table of Lester Pollock, who was later the chair of the board, but at the time he was chair of the budget committee. And he knew, and Marty Lipton knew, I'd asked Rita for $5 million for this program. And he knows this is the morning she's going to tell it or not. And she looks at me, and she takes an envelope out, and she gives it to me, and she said, "So, Gus and I have decided to support your program." She doesn't say, "I'm giving you $5 million, you know." But even a guy from the streets of Brooklyn knew, you don't open the envelope up and look, you know, you put it in your suit. And, you know, in those days I owned suits. And you put it in your suit pocket, and I'm dying to know what's in there. It's going to burn it away. But she'd given us something, so I get up, I give her a hug, and I give for Lester Pollock the thumbs up, you know, from behind us. And so he's dying to know, and I'm dying to know. We sit down, and she says to me, "You know, I love this idea, but Harvard Law School knows," because Gus had created MTV and Nickelodeon and cable TV, and they had cashed out, and they were being very philanthropic. He said, "Harvard knows we've made it, and they're after us for a big gift, but they don't have anything inspirational. They don't have anything inspirational. Can you give me an idea for Harvard?" This is a true story. So I came up with a couple of ideas, but I said to her as we left, I said, "Listen, I'm going to tell you one thing. Whatever you've just given me for NYU, you should give Harvard more. It's not that they need it, but I know the story. I met Lisa there. That's the most important thing in my life. You met Gus there. You were married in their chapel. You should give them more." So you roll the clock forward, and it's June, and our terrific fundraiser here, Deborah Lamort, convened every 2 years a conference of all the deans of the law schools. And of the 200 law schools, maybe 180 came in Jackson Hole, 3 days, around fundraising. Because if you think about it, fundraising is a positive-sum game. If somebody gets a $50 million gift, it's more likely somebody else is going to get a $50 million gift. So the development officers tend to cooperate on this. And by now, you know, this was happening, and I'm me, and the deans always used to have me keynote their meetings with a little bit of, you know, pep talk, you know, why this is a vocation, you know. And I'd usually be introduced as the spiritual leader of the deans. But Harvard and we had just finished our campaigns synoptically, and they came in number 1 and number 2 in the history of legal education, and we were number 1. And the New York Times, you could go look this up, the New York Times Magazine had embedded a reporter here for 6 weeks. His name was James Traub. You could Google it. And he had done an article in the New York Times Magazine with the headline, "Has NYU surpassed Harvard as the nation's leading law school?" And they had Bob Clark of Harvard introduce me. And Bob gets up, and we were friends. And he gets up, and he said, "I'm now going to introduce," he doesn't say the spiritual leader of the deans. He says, "the master marketer, the P.T. Barnum of legal education." And he refers to this article. And I'm really pissed, you know. And I get up, and I say, "Master marketer, master marketer, you reduce my vocation to marketing?" And I said, "Let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. Rita Hauser gave us that $5 million to create a program that is going to transform the way law is thought of as a sacred instrument around the world and empower people. But did you see the last issue of the Harvard magazine? The houses," and I told the story, "you should give Harvard more," in the dean's meeting. And I said, They gave Harvard $13 million. And what did they get in return? Look at that magazine. Because there, on the cover of the magazine, is a guy on a scaffold, chiseling in the last part of the R in the name Hauser Hall. I said, now what is that? You give to Harvard, we give you immortality. Granite immortality. I said, who the hell is the master marketer? We gave meaning and justice, and he gives a little cement. We are not cement, ladies and gentlemen. That's the purpose of today, right? We're not cement. We have a mission, and you are the senior members and the carriers of the mission. Thank you for putting up with me.